Smoke poured through the corridor before anyone understood what was happening. A maid screamed near the east staircase, and within moments the entire household was awake, running through the halls with candles shaking in their hands. The Duke's chambers were burning, flames climbing the velvet curtains and eating through the wooden beams above his bed. Edmund Hale, Duke of Ashworth, woke to the smell of smoke filling his lungs. He rolled out of bed instinctively, grabbing nothing but the robe draped over a chair, and threw open his door to find the hallway already thick with gray haze. He shouted for the staff to wake the rest of the house, his voice hoarse from the smoke, and pushed forward through the corridor toward the main staircase. Servants rushed past him carrying buckets of water, though it was clear from the roar behind the closed doors that water would do little good. The fire had already taken hold of the room, spreading fast along the old timber frame that had stood for over 100 years. Edmund stood at the top of the stairs, watching the orange light flicker beneath the door of his own chambers, and felt something strange settle over him. Not fear exactly. Something closer to disbelief. By the time the fire was contained to the east wing alone, the sky outside had begun to lighten with the first gray hint of morning. The staff stood in the courtyard. Soot streaked across their faces, counting heads to be certain everyone had escaped. Edmund stood apart from them, his robe hanging loose, his bare feet cold against the stone. He looked up at the blackened window that had once been his own, smoke still curling from the frame, and said nothing. Mrs. Abbott, the housekeeper, approached him carefully, holding a blanket she had fetched from the linen room. She draped it over his shoulders without asking permission, the way she had done small things for him since he was a boy in that house. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "the room cannot be used, not for many weeks. The beams above will need replacing before anyone can even step inside safely." Edmund nodded slowly, still staring at the ruined window. He had lived in that room since he was 12 years old. It had been his father's room before him, and his grandfather's before that. Now it was ash and blackened stone. "Where am I meant to sleep then?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Mrs. Abbott hesitated. "There are guest rooms on the west side, Your Grace, but they have not been aired properly in months. The only chambers kept ready at all times are the ones beside the Duchess's rooms. They share the connecting hall. It would take no time at all to prepare them for you tonight." Edmund's jaw tightened at the mention of his wife. He and Eleanor had lived under the same roof for nearly 2 years, married in a ceremony arranged by their fathers long before either of them had a say in the matter. In all that time he had visited her rooms perhaps a dozen times, and always briefly. Always with the same careful distance between them that had defined their entire marriage. They shared a name and a title. They did not share a life. "There must be somewhere else," he said. "There is nowhere else ready before nightfall, Your Grace," Mrs. Abbott replied gently. "I am sorry." Edmund said nothing for a long moment. The sun was fully up now, casting pale light across the ruined wing of the house. He thought of sleeping in a cold, unaired room on the far side of the house, alone in dust and silence, and found that even that seemed better than the alternative. But there was no true alternative, not with the fire still smoldering behind him, and half the household in a state of quiet panic. "Prepare the room beside hers, then," he said finally, "just for tonight." It ended up being far more than one night. By mid-morning, the estate's steward, a careful man named Nathaniel Price, arrived to inspect the damage with 2 builders from the village. He walked the length of the burned corridor with a grim expression, running his hand along the charred wood, testing the strength of what remained. When he finally returned to report to the Duke, his face told most of the story before he spoke a single word. "The support beams are compromised throughout the entire east wing, Your Grace," he said. "Not just your chambers. The fire spread along the old timber faster than it should have, which tells me the wood beneath the plaster was already weakened by rot. We cannot simply patch this. The whole wing needs to be rebuilt from the frame up." "How long?" Edmund asked. Nathaniel exchanged a glance with the builders before answering. "A month. At the very least, Your Grace. Perhaps longer if we find further damage once we begin." Edmund closed his eyes briefly. A month. An entire month sleeping steps away from a wife he barely spoke to, sharing a hallway, sharing servants, sharing meals he usually took alone in his study. The idea sat uneasily in his chest, though he could not entirely say why. He walked back toward the house slowly, past the servants still clearing debris from the courtyard, past the scorched rose bushes that had been planted beneath his window years ago. He thought of Eleanor, of the quiet, composed way she carried herself through the halls, never asking anything of him, never complaining about the distance he kept. He wondered, briefly, what she would think of him moving into the room beside hers. He did not have to wonder long. She was waiting near the entrance hall when he arrived, already dressed for the day despite the early hour, her dark hair pinned neatly and her expression unreadable. She must have heard the commotion in the night and risen to see what had happened. "Are you unharmed?" she asked, her voice steady but not unkind. "I am," he said. "The room is gone. The wing will need rebuilding." She nodded slowly, absorbing this without visible surprise. "I heard Mrs. Abbott mention you would be staying near my rooms until the work is finished." "Only until the work is finished," Edmund said quickly, as though she might object, as though the arrangement needed defending before she had even raised a concern. Eleanor studied him for a moment, something unreadable passing behind her calm eyes. "Of course," she said simply. "I will have Alice prepare anything you need." That was all. No protest, no discomfort visible on her face, though Edmund could not shake the feeling that something had shifted slightly in the air between them, some small crack in the careful wall that had stood between their two lives for 2 years. Throughout the afternoon, the household worked to clear away the ruin of the East Wing. Servants carried out blackened furniture, scorched paintings, and the twisted metal remains of what had once been a fine writing desk passed down through 3 generations of the Hale family. Edmund watched from the courtyard as pieces of his old life were carried past him on the shoulders of men he barely knew by name, each item a small reminder of how quickly comfort could be stripped away. Nathaniel walked beside him for a while, offering quiet updates on the progress of the assessment. The fire, he explained, had likely started from a spark in the old chimney flue, one that had not been properly cleaned in recent months. It was not carelessness on the part of the staff, but simple age catching up with a house built long before anyone alive could remember its foundations being laid. "We will need timber from the North Forest," Nathaniel said, "and skilled hands to match the old carpentry. I have already sent word to the village. The sooner we begin, the sooner your grace can return to proper chambers." Edmund only nodded, his attention drifting toward the main house, toward the west wing where his temporary room now waited. He found himself thinking less about the timber and the carpentry, and more about the strange arrangement he had agreed to that morning. He had spent 2 years building careful habits to avoid unnecessary contact with his wife, habits that would now be impossible to maintain with only a single door separating their 2 lives. Alice, Eleanor's maid, passed him in the hallway later that afternoon, carrying fresh linens toward his new chamber. She curtsied quickly, her eyes flicking toward him with poorly hidden curiosity before she hurried on. Edmund suspected the entire staff already knew of the arrangement, and likely had opinions about it that they were far too well trained to voice aloud. By evening, his few salvaged belongings had been carried into the chamber beside hers. It was smaller than his old room, simpler in its furnishings but clean and untouched by smoke. A single connecting door stood between his new chambers and Eleanor's private rooms, a door that, as far as he knew, had not been opened by either of them in longer than he could remember. He stood in front of it for a long moment before undressing for bed, staring at the old brass handle, listening to the faint sounds of movement on the other side. He heard her voice, low and unhurried, speaking to her maid. He heard the soft closing of a wardrobe, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a life he knew almost nothing about, despite sharing a name with the woman living it. He turned away from the door and lay down in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the settling creaks of a house that had nearly burned around him only hours before. Sleep did not come easily. He kept thinking of the fire, of how close the flames had come to the room where he had slept every night of his adult life, and of the strange, uncomfortable nearness of the woman just beyond that thin wooden door. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight. Edmund closed his eyes and told himself that a month would pass quickly enough. He did not yet know how wrong he was. In her own chambers, Eleanor sat by the window long after the house had gone quiet, watching the last traces of smoke drift into the night sky above the ruined wing. She had spent 2 years learning not to expect anything from the man she had married, learning to build a life that did not depend on his attention or his presence. Now he was sleeping only steps away from her, close enough that she could hear him shift in his bed through the thin connecting wall. She did not know what to make of the strange knot forming in her chest. It was not quite hope. She would not allow herself hope, not after 2 years of careful distance. But it was something, a small, unfamiliar flicker of curiosity about a husband she had long ago stopped trying to understand. She rose from the window at last and blew out her candle, the room falling into darkness around her. Whatever this month would bring, she told herself firmly, it would not change what she already knew to be true. A fire had destroyed his chambers. It would take far more than proximity to destroy the walls that stood between them. Neither of them slept easily that first night, and neither of them yet understood that the fire behind them was nothing compared to what was quietly beginning to stir on either side of that thin connecting door. A sharp knock on the connecting door woke Edmund before dawn on his 3rd morning in the West Wing. He sat up quickly, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, before remembering where he was and why. He crossed the cold floor and opened the door to find Alice standing there, wringing her hands. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, "but the water closet on this side has stopped working properly. The Duchess asked if you might use hers this morning, since the plumber cannot come until later in the day." Edmund blinked at the request, feeling strangely exposed by the idea of stepping into a space so clearly hers. He agreed anyway, because there was little else to do, and followed Alice through the connecting door into a room he had not properly seen in longer than he cared to admit. Eleanor's chambers were nothing like he expected. He had imagined something delicate and overly soft, the kind of room described in the letters young brides wrote to their mothers. Instead, he found shelves lined with books on estate management, a writing desk covered in neat columns of figures, and a window seat worn smooth from what must have been years of use. It looked less like the room of a pampered duchess and more like the study of someone who worked. Eleanor herself was already dressed, standing near the window with a cup of tea in her hands, watching him take in the room with poorly hidden curiosity. "Good morning," she said simply, gesturing toward the small door on the far side that led to the water closet. "It should not take you long." "Thank you," he said, feeling oddly formal standing in her private space. His eyes drifted to the writing desk again. "Do you manage the household accounts yourself?" "Someone must," she said, a faint edge in her voice. "You have never asked before." The comment landed harder than she likely intended, and Edmund felt the sting of it settle in his chest. He said nothing further, retreating quickly into the water closet, grateful for the excuse to end the conversation before it grew more uncomfortable. That small exchange set the tone for the days that followed. Living so close together made avoidance nearly impossible. They crossed paths at breakfast, since the dining room sat between their two temporary routes through the house. They passed each other in the hallway outside their rooms, exchanging brief nods that neither quite knew how to expand into real conversation. The staff, accustomed to serving two people who rarely interacted, seemed unsure how to manage a household where the Duke and Duchess now shared nearly every hour of the day. On the second morning, the household gathered for breakfast in a strange new rhythm. Edmund arrived first, as he always had, taking his seat at the head of the table out of long habit. Eleanor arrived moments later, pausing briefly at the sight of him already seated, before taking her usual place at the opposite end without comment. The butler, a steady older man named Mr. Barrow, moved between them with visible uncertainty, unsure whether to serve them together or wait for some signal that had never before been necessary. "Will your Grace be riding out to the North Forest today?" Mr. Barrow asked, directing the question toward Edmund but glancing briefly at Eleanor as though checking for some unspoken objection. Edmund answered that he would, that Nathaniel wished to show him the timber selection before the builders began cutting. Eleanor said nothing, buttering a piece of toast with careful attention, though Edmund noticed her eyes flick toward him once before returning to her plate. It struck him, not for the first time, how little he actually knew about the woman sitting across from him after 2 years of marriage. He knew her preferred seat at the table. He did not know her favorite season, or whether she had ever wished for children, or what she thought about on the long evenings he spent locked away in his study. He nearly asked her something that morning, some small question meant to bridge the distance, but the words caught in his throat before he could shape them properly, and the moment passed in silence. Small frictions began to surface almost immediately. Edmund was used to absolute quiet in the mornings, a habit built from years of solitary living, but Eleanor rose early, and often practiced the pianoforte in the music room just beneath his temporary chambers. The sound drifted up through the floorboards, simple melodies played with more feeling than skill, and though he told himself it annoyed him, he found himself listening more closely than he wanted to admit. For her part, Eleanor grew frustrated by his habit of leaving correspondence scattered across the shared writing table in the connecting hallway, papers she had to move aside each morning to reach her own study materials. She said nothing about it for the first week, choosing instead to simply stack his letters into a neat pile with visible restraint. On the fourth evening, a small dinner had been arranged for a visiting magistrate and his wife, a courtesy Edmund had agreed to weeks before the fire had ever occurred. He had nearly forgotten the engagement entirely amid the chaos of the rebuilding, and it was Eleanor who reminded him of it that afternoon, finding him in the courtyard reviewing timber deliveries with Nathaniel. "You have not forgotten the magistrate is dining with us tonight," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Edmund had, in fact, forgotten entirely, and his expression must have given him away, because Eleanor's mouth tightened slightly before she spoke again. "I have already instructed the kitchen and arranged the seating," she said. "You need only appear presentable and speak as though you have not spent the entire day covered in sawdust." He thanked her, somewhat sheepishly. and the dinner that evening passed more smoothly than he had expected. Eleanor guided the conversation with practiced ease, asking the magistrate's wife about her garden, and steering discussion away from the fire whenever the topic threatened to arise, sparing Edmund the discomfort of explaining the damaged wing in detail to guests. He found himself watching her across the table more than he watched their guests, noting the graceful way she managed a room, a skill he had never once bothered to notice in 2 years of marriage. After the guests departed, Edmund lingered in the drawing room longer than usual, watching Eleanor direct the servants in clearing the table. "You handled that very well," he said, the compliment feeling unfamiliar in his mouth. "I have had a great deal of practice managing dinners alone," she replied, without looking up from the task at hand. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a plain statement of fact, but it landed with quiet weight regardless. Edmund said nothing further, retreating to his temporary chambers with the comment settling uneasily in his chest. Another small reminder of how much of her life had unfolded without him paying any real attention to it at all. By the 5th day, restraint gave way to a small confrontation. Edmund descended for breakfast to find his letters, along with a half-finished draft of a report to his solicitor, sitting in a tidy stack on the sideboard rather than the table where he had left them. "Someone has moved my papers," he said to the room in general, though only Eleanor sat at the table. "I moved them," she said calmly, not looking up from her own plate. "The table is meant to be shared, and I needed the space to review the tenant ledgers before the steward arrives." "You might have asked," Edmund said, an edge creeping into his voice that surprised even him. Eleanor set down her fork and finally looked at him directly. "In 2 years, Your Grace, I have learned not to expect that courtesy from you. Forgive me if old habits are difficult to break in a single week." The words were quiet, but they struck with more force than any raised voice could have managed. Edmund had no answer ready. He sat down across from her instead, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them as the servants moved quietly around the edges of the room, clearly aware that something had shifted in the air. The tension did not resolve itself quickly. For 2 more days, the household moved through a careful, brittle politeness, each of them speaking only when necessary, each retreating to opposite ends of the house whenever possible. Edmund threw himself into overseeing the rebuilding of the East Wing, spending long hours with Nathaniel and the builders, partly out of genuine concern for the work, and partly to avoid the quiet discomfort of the West Wing. It was on the 7th night that something shifted, quiet and unplanned. Edmund could not sleep, his mind circling the argument at breakfast, replaying Eleanor's words about old habits with an irritation that felt less directed at her and more at himself. He rose from bed near midnight and walked to the window, intending only to look out at the moonlit ruin of the East Wing, when he heard a soft sound from beyond the connecting door. He hesitated only a moment before knocking gently. Eleanor opened the door still fully dressed, a single candle burning on her desk behind her, ledgers spread open across its surface. She looked surprised to see him, though she did not close the door. "I could not sleep," Edmund said, feeling suddenly foolish standing there in his nightclothes. "I heard movement. I am reviewing the tenant accounts before the quarter closes," she said. "I find the numbers easier to manage at night, when the house is quiet." He glanced past her at the desk, at the careful rows of figures written in a neat, practiced hand. "You do this every quarter?" he asked. "Every quarter for the last 2 years," she said. "Since your steward at the time proved unreliable with the smaller accounts, I did not think you noticed either way." Edmund stepped further into the room without quite deciding to, drawn by something he could not name. "I did not know," he admitted. "I should have." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something guarded in her expression slowly loosening, just slightly, like a knot given a little more room to breathe. "Perhaps you should sit," she said finally, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "If you cannot sleep either, you might as well make yourself useful and check my addition on the tenant column." It was not an apology, and it was not quite forgiveness for the days of tension between them, but it was an opening, small and unremarkable as it seemed. Edmund sat across from her. Picking up the ledger, she slid toward him, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like the quiet beginning of something neither of them had expected the fire to bring. They worked through the numbers together until the candle burned low, exchanging only occasional words about the figures in front of them, but something had changed in the shape of the silence they shared. When Edmund finally rose to return to his own chambers, Eleanor looked up at him with an expression he could not quite place. "Good night, Edmund," she said, using his given name for what he realized was the first time since their wedding day. "Good night, Eleanor," he replied, and found that he meant it more warmly than he had meant anything in a very long time. He returned to his own chambers but did not immediately climb into bed. Instead, he stood by the window for a long while, looking out at the scaffolding rising slowly around the ruined east wing, thinking about the careful figures in Eleanor's ledger and the years of quiet competence he had never once acknowledged. He thought of his father, who had arranged this marriage with a cold practicality that left no room for affection, and of the assumptions he had carried since childhood about what a wife was meant to be within these walls. He had assumed distance was simply the nature of such an arrangement. He was beginning to suspect that assumption had cost him more than he realized. The following morning brought a small but noticeable change. Eleanor still rose early to practice the pianoforte, but she left her door open as she played, the music drifting more freely through the connecting hallway. Edmund found himself lingering near the doorway on his way down to breakfast, listening a moment longer than necessary before continuing on. Neither of them spoke of the shift directly. It existed instead in small gestures, a slightly longer glance across the breakfast table, a willingness to share the sideboard without complaint, a comment about the weather that lasted a few sentences longer than it needed to. Nathaniel noticed the change first among the staff, remarking to Mrs. Abbott over their own morning tea that the house felt different somehow, quieter in its tension and warmer in its silences. Mrs. Abbott only smiled knowingly, having watched enough marriages in her long years of service to recognize the early signs of a thaw when she saw one, even if the two people at the center of it had not yet named what was happening between them. By the end of the first week, the rebuilding of the East Wing had progressed enough that Nathaniel reported real optimism about finishing within the original month, provided no further damage was discovered in the walls. Edmund received the news with less relief than he expected. A month had once felt like an unwelcome sentence. Now, standing in the doorway of his temporary chambers and hearing Eleanor's quiet footsteps on the other side of the connecting door, he found himself in no particular hurry for the walls to be rebuilt at all. A loud crash from the garden sent Edmund running from his study before he had even registered why. He reached the terrace to find one of the old stone urns shattered across the path, and Eleanor standing over it with her hands pressed to her mouth, a gardener's boy beside her looking pale with fright. It slipped from the ledge above, Eleanor explained quickly, before Edmund could ask. It nearly struck him. He is unharmed, only frightened. Edmund knelt beside the boy, checking him carefully for injury despite the child's insistence that he was fine, embarrassed by the fuss. It was only once Edmund was satisfied that no harm had come to anyone that he noticed how close Eleanor herself had come to the falling stone, close enough that a streak of dust marked the shoulder of her dress. "You might have been hurt as well," he said, straightening and looking at her properly for the first time since the crash. "I moved quickly enough," she said, though her hands were not quite steady as she brushed the dust from her sleeve. He sent the boy off with a coin and instructions to rest for the remainder of the day, and once they were alone on the terrace, Edmund found himself unwilling to simply walk away, as he might have done weeks before. "Come," he said, gesturing toward the garden bench beneath the old oak tree. "Sit a moment. You had a fright." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting, settling onto the bench with the careful composure she brought to everything, though Edmund noticed her hand still trembled faintly in her lap. They sat together in silence for a while, the late afternoon sun slanting warm through the leaves above them, before Edmund spoke again. "You are very good with the staff," he said. "The boy trusts you." "They trust kindness when they see it consistently," she replied. "It is not difficult to earn, only easy to forget to offer." The comment was gentle, but Edmund understood well enough that it was aimed partly at him, a quiet observation about years of distance he had kept from nearly everyone in the household, including her. He did not argue the point. Instead, he found himself asking a question that had been sitting unspoken in his chest for days. "Why did you never complain?" he asked. "About any of it, the distance, the silence. 2 years, and you never once asked more of me." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching the light move through the leaves above them. "I asked once," she said finally, "in our first month of marriage. I asked if you might join me for dinner more than the required occasions. You told me you preferred to dine alone with your accounts, and I decided then that further asking would only invite further disappointment. It seemed simpler to build a life that did not depend on you noticing me at all." The words settled into Edmund with quiet, uncomfortable weight. He remembered that conversation only vaguely, a passing exchange he had not thought worth remembering at the time, though it had apparently shaped 2 years of careful distance on her part. He had no defense for it, and he did not attempt to offer one. "I am sorry," he said instead, simply and without embellishment. Eleanor turned to look at him properly, something shifting behind her calm expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of something less guarded. "You have never said that to me before," she said. "I have never had reason to look closely enough to know I should," he admitted. They sat together a while longer, the conversation drifting into smaller, gentler territory. Eleanor spoke of her childhood home in the countryside, of a mother who had taught her estate management out of necessity after her father's early death, of the quiet satisfaction she took in balancing a ledger correctly or seeing a struggling tenant farm recover under careful guidance. Edmund found himself listening with genuine interest, asking questions he had never thought to ask before, surprised by how much there was to learn about a woman he had shared a name with for 2 years. In turn, he spoke of his own father, a hard, distant man who had taught him that a duke's worth lay in the strength of his estate and the coldness of his judgment, never in the warmth of his household. Affection, his father had always said, was a luxury for men without responsibilities. Edmund had carried that belief into his marriage without ever questioning it, applying the same careful distance to his wife that his father had applied to every relationship in his own life. "That explains a great deal," Eleanor said quietly, once he had finished. "I always assumed you simply did not care to know me. I did not consider that you might never have learned how." "It is not an excuse," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is an explanation, and there is a difference." A few days after their conversation on the garden bench, Nathaniel requested that the Duke visit one of the tenant farms at the edge of the estate, where a family had fallen behind on repairs to their barn roof after a difficult harvest season. Edmund agreed to go, and to his mild surprise, Eleanor asked to accompany him, explaining that she had corresponded with the tenant's wife for months regarding the household ledgers and wished to see the farm for herself. The ride out took the better part of an hour, and Edmund found himself talking more freely than he had in years, pointing out landmarks from his childhood, a stream where he had once fallen through thin ice as a boy, a hill where his grandfather had taught him to shoot. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly following the stories rather than simply enduring them out of politeness. At the farm, they found the family anxious and apologetic, the husband stammering through an explanation of the roof damage and the missed harvest that had left them short on funds for repairs. Edmund listened patiently, more patiently than he might have managed only weeks before, and it was Eleanor who quietly suggested a solution, drawing from her own careful knowledge of the estate's accounts, to propose covering the repair cost against next year's rent, rather than demanding immediate payment the family could not provide. Edmund agreed without hesitation, impressed by how naturally she balanced fairness with practicality, a skill he realized he had never bothered to develop himself, having always left such decisions to stewards and clerks. On the ride home, he told her as much, and she accepted the compliment with a small, pleased smile that stayed with him long after they had returned to the house. "You have been managing so much of this estate quietly, for so long," he said, without me even noticing. "Someone had to," she said simply, though there was no bitterness in it this time, only a quiet acknowledgement of the truth between them. That evening, over dinner, Edmund found himself asking more questions than he had asked in the entire 2 years of their marriage combined. He learned that Eleanor had once hoped to travel to the northern lakes as a girl, a plan interrupted by her father's death and the responsibilities that followed. He learned that she disliked the color yellow, though she wore it often because her mother had loved it. He learned small, unimportant details that somehow felt enormous in their accumulation, each one a small piece of a woman he was only now beginning to truly know. In turn, he shared pieces of himself he had never spoken aloud to anyone, memories of a childhood spent trying to earn his father's approval through discipline and distance rather than warmth, a lesson so deeply carved into him that he had never questioned whether it served him well as a husband. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally offering a quiet observation that helped him see his own history a little differently than he had before. As the days that followed unfolded, the two of them found small excuses to spend time together that had nothing to do with duty or necessity. Edmund began joining her for the evening review of household accounts, not because his help was strictly needed, but because he found he preferred her company to the solitude of his study. Eleanor, in turn, began accompanying him on his morning inspections of the rebuilding work, walking the scaffolding grounds beside him and asking Nathaniel thoughtful questions about the timber and the foundation repairs. The staff noticed the shift with quiet approval. Mrs. Abbott began setting 2 places at the small breakfast table by the window rather than the long formal table that had once separated them by its entire length. Mr. Barrow found himself announcing dinner to both of them together rather than delivering separate messages to each. Even Alice, who had spent 2 years quietly pitying her mistress's cold marriage, began humming to herself as she prepared the Duchess's morning dresses, sensing a change in the household's mood that lifted her own spirits along with it. One afternoon, Edmund returned from the village with a small parcel wrapped in plain paper, which he left on Eleanor's writing desk without comment before retreating to his own chambers, suddenly uncertain whether the gesture was foolish. When she found it that evening, she unwrapped it to discover a slim volume of poetry about the northern lakes she had once longed to visit as a girl, along with a folded map of the region marked with a few small notes in his handwriting, suggestions of routes she might someday take if she ever wished to see the lakes for herself. She found him in the study later that night, the book held carefully against her chest. "You remembered," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You mentioned it only once," he said, feeling suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. "I did not think it worth forgetting." Eleanor crossed the room and, for the first time since their wedding day, reached out and took his hand in both of hers, a simple gesture that carried more weight than either of them quite expected. "Thank you," she said simply, and Edmund found that his voice failed him entirely for a moment, caught somewhere between surprise and a warmth he had not allowed himself to feel in longer than he could remember. They stood together like that for a long moment, neither speaking, the study quiet around them except for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. When she finally released his hand and stepped back, something had shifted permanently between them, a boundary crossed that neither seemed inclined to retreat from. The following days brought a new ease to their interactions, small touches that had once been unthinkable becoming natural, a hand offered to help her down from a carriage, a shared glance across a crowded room during a visit from neighboring gentry, a quiet laugh shared over some small household mishap that would once have passed unnoticed by either of them. The staff watched the transformation with quiet delight, though none dared comment on it directly, aware that whatever was blooming between the Duke and Duchess was still delicate enough to disturb with too much attention. One evening, roughly 2 weeks into the arrangement, Edmund found Eleanor in the music room after dinner, seated at the pianoforte though she was not playing, her fingers simply resting on the keys as she stared out the darkened window. He entered quietly, unsure whether to disturb her thoughts, but she glanced up and offered a small smile that invited him to stay. "Play something," he said, settling into the chair near the window. "I am out of practice," she warned, though she began playing anyway, a simple melody that filled the room with unexpected warmth. Edmund watched her hands move across the keys, watched the quiet concentration on her face, and felt something settle in his chest that he did not immediately recognize. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to simply sit and appreciate another person's presence, that the sensation felt almost foreign, a muscle long unused finally beginning to remember its purpose. When the melody ended, neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence comfortable rather than strained for the first time in longer than either could easily recall. "I did not expect this," Edmund said finally. "Any of it." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "I had made peace with a very different kind of marriage. I am not certain what to do with this version instead. Perhaps we simply continue," he said, "and see what it becomes." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the candlelight catching the uncertainty and the cautious hope both present in her expression at once. "Perhaps," she agreed quietly. It was not a declaration of anything grand, no sweeping promise or dramatic turn. Only two people, slowly, carefully allowing themselves to consider a future neither had thought possible only weeks before. But as Edmund walked back toward his temporary chambers that night, passing the connecting door that had once felt like an uncrossable boundary between them, he found himself thinking that perhaps the fire that destroyed his old rooms had, in some strange and unplanned way, begun to build something far more valuable in their place. Later that night, unable to sleep, Edmund found himself once again standing before the connecting door, though this time he did not hesitate before knocking. Eleanor opened it wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen before, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply taking in the quiet strangeness of how far they had come from the careful strangers who had shared a house without truly sharing a life. "I keep thinking about the fire," he admitted, "about how something so destructive could lead to this." "Perhaps it did not lead to this on its own," Eleanor said. "Perhaps it only gave us the excuse to notice what might have been possible all along, if either of us had been brave enough to look for it sooner." He considered this for a long moment, watching the candlelight flicker across her face. "I do not want to lose this when the wing is rebuilt," he said finally, the admission costing him more effort than he expected. "I do not want to return to my old rooms and let the distance close back over us the way it did before." "Then do not let it," she said simply, as though the solution were as straightforward as she made it sound. "We are not obligated to return to what we were simply because the walls are repaired." The conversation lingered between them long after he returned to his own bed that night, a quiet promise neither had fully spoken aloud, but both seemed to understand regardless. Edmund lay awake turning it over in his mind, the shape of a future entirely different from the one he had accepted as inevitable only weeks before, one built not on obligation and distance but on the kind of quiet partnership he had only just begun to understand was possible between a husband and wife. He thought of his father again, of the cold lessons about duty and detachment that had shaped his every assumption about marriage, and found himself, for the first time, actively rejecting them. Whatever his father had believed about affection being a weakness unsuited to a duke's responsibilities, Edmund was beginning to suspect the opposite was closer to the truth, that the quiet strength he had witnessed in Eleanor over these past weeks was not despite her warmth but built upon it. He did not yet know that outside the walls of the estate, word of the fire and the unusual living arrangement it had created was already spreading through the drawing rooms of society, carried by tongues eager for scandal, and by at least one relative who saw in the situation an opportunity too useful to ignore. A carriage arrived unannounced at the estate gates just after noon, its dark green paint and gold trim instantly recognizable to the staff as belonging to Julian Vane, a distant cousin of Edmund's who had rarely visited in the 2 years since the wedding. Mrs. Abbott hurried to inform the Duke the moment the carriage was spotted, her expression carrying more concern than the news of a simple visit usually warranted. Edmund met his cousin in the entrance hall, offering the polite greeting expected between relatives, though something in Julian's easy smile had always unsettled him even as a boy. Julian was a few years older, handsome in a practiced way, with the kind of charm that had won him favor in every drawing room in the city, despite a reputation for debts he rarely bothered to settle. "Cousin," Julian said warmly, clasping Edmund's hand, "I came the moment I heard about the fire. Terrible business. I trust you were unharmed." "Quite unharmed," Edmund replied evenly, though he already suspected the visit had little to do with genuine concern. Julian's visits historically arrived only when some benefit could be extracted from them. Julian's gaze drifted toward the staircase, where Eleanor had just appeared, dressed simply for an afternoon of estate work. He offered her an elaborate bow, the kind reserved for society gatherings rather than family visits. "Duchess," he said smoothly, "you look remarkably well for a woman managing a household mid-renovation." Eleanor returned the greeting with polite reserve, though Edmund noticed the careful distance she kept, a wariness that suggested she too sensed something beneath Julian's charm. Over dinner that evening, Julian steered the conversation with practiced ease, drawing out details of the fire, the extent of the damage, and, with particular interest, the sleeping arrangements that had resulted from it. Edmund answered carefully, offering little beyond the basic facts, though Julian's questions grew more pointed as the meal progressed. "It must be quite an adjustment," Julian said, "sharing quarters so closely after so long apart. I confess I always assumed your marriage ran along more traditional lines." The comment landed with deliberate weight, and Edmund felt his jaw tighten at the implication buried within it. "Our arrangement is our own concern, Julian," he said, his tone cooler than before. Of course," Julian said, holding up a placating hand, though the smile never left his face. "I only mean that society does love a story, and a duke suddenly sharing his wife's chambers after 2 years of famous distance is precisely the kind of story that travels quickly." Eleanor's fork paused briefly over her plate before she continued eating, her composure never fully breaking, though Edmund caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. He said nothing further on the matter that evening, but the conversation lingered in his mind long after Julian had retired to the guest quarters. Julian remained at the estate for 3 days, during which time Edmund grew increasingly certain that his cousin's interest extended well beyond simple curiosity. He asked pointed questions of the staff when he believed no one of importance was listening, inquired about the state of the estate's finances with more detail than any casual visitor required, and made several comments in passing about how a scandal involving the Duke's marriage might affect his standing within the family and among his creditors. It was Nathaniel who finally brought the matter to Edmund's attention directly, having overheard Julian speaking with a stable hand about the fire's origins in a manner that suggested more than idle curiosity. "He was asking whether the fire might have started deliberately, Your Grace," Nathaniel said quietly, finding Edmund alone in his study, "and whether such a rumor, if it took hold in society, might force you to make certain decisions about the estate's management, given how it would look for a duke unable to control even his own household's safety." Edmund's expression darkened considerably at this. Julian owed considerable sums to several men in the city, debts that a share of the Ashworth estate, however small, could easily resolve. A scandal that weakened Edmund's standing, that painted him as reckless or incompetent, might create exactly the kind of opening Julian needed to press old family claims to a portion of the estate's income. Claims that had been dismissed by Edmund's father decades before but never fully extinguished in law. Edmund spent the better part of an afternoon reviewing old family correspondence in the estate's private archive, searching for the details of the claim Nathaniel had mentioned. He found it eventually. a faded letter from decades past in which his grandfather's younger brother had disputed the division of certain lands upon his grandfather's inheritance, a dispute settled quietly and never fully resolved in law, only buried beneath years of silence and family pride. Julian, as it turned out, was the grandson of that very brother, raised on stories of an inheritance unfairly denied, stories that had clearly shaped a lifetime of resentment dressed up as easy charm. He is not merely a distant cousin passing through out of concern, Edmund told Eleanor that evening, showing her the old letter. He believes, or has convinced himself to believe, that a portion of this estate rightfully belongs to his branch of the family. A scandal that weakens my position, that raises questions about my judgment or my fitness to manage the estate, gives him grounds to press that claim publicly, perhaps even before a sympathetic magistrate, who enjoys a good scandal as much as anyone in the city. Eleanor read the letter carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is decades old," she said. "Surely no court would revisit a matter so long settled." "Settled quietly is not the same as settled in law," Edmund said grimly. "My father chose to let the matter rest rather than risk airing family disputes publicly. Julian's father did the same. But Julian has no such reservations, particularly if he believes public sympathy might favor him over a duke whose own household nearly burned down around him." By the time Julian departed, the damage had already begun. Within a week, whispers reached the estate through letters from acquaintances in the city, rumors circulating in the drawing rooms of society about the mysterious fire, and the duke's sudden intimacy with a wife he had famously ignored for 2 years. Some whispered that the fire had been set deliberately by a desperate wife seeking her husband's attention. Others suggested darker things entirely, questioning whether Edmund's judgment could be trusted at all if he had allowed his own estate to fall into such disrepair that a fire could spread so easily. Eleanor received a letter from her own sister, alarmed by rumors she had heard secondhand, asking with careful concern whether everything was truly well at the estate. Eleanor read the letter twice before setting it aside, her expression troubled in a way Edmund had not seen since the earliest days of the fire. "They are saying I started it," she said quietly, when Edmund found her later that evening, "that I set the fire myself to force you into proximity with me, as though 2 years of distance had driven me to such lengths." Edmund felt a surge of anger at the suggestion, sharper than anything he had felt toward his cousin before. "That is absurd," he said. "No one who knows you would believe such a thing." "Society rarely concerns itself with whether a rumor is true," Eleanor said, "only whether it is interesting enough to repeat." Mrs. Abbott brought further troubling news a few days later, having heard from a cousin employed in a city household that Julian had been seen dining with a newspaper editor, known for printing scandalous stories about the aristocracy, in exchange for a fee. It seemed increasingly clear that Julian intended not simply to let rumors spread naturally through drawing room gossip, but to see them printed and circulated as widely as possible, ensuring maximum damage to Edmund's reputation, before any denial could catch up to the story. Edmund wrote immediately to his solicitor in the city, a careful and discreet man named Peter Grant, requesting any information available about Julian's current debts and his relationship with the editor in question. The reply came within days, confirming what Edmund had already suspected. Julian owed considerable sums to at least 3 separate creditors, sums that had grown increasingly urgent in recent months, and had indeed met with the editor on more than one occasion, though the exact nature of their arrangement remained unclear. Armed with this knowledge, Edmund felt a grim satisfaction at understanding the shape of the threat facing them, though understanding it did little to soften its impact on the household. The strain of the rumors began to show in small ways over the following days. Eleanor grew quieter at meals, more careful in her words, as though bracing herself against some further blow. Edmund noticed her hesitate before reaching for his hand in front of the staff, a small gesture that had become natural between them in recent weeks, now suddenly weighted with the fear of being watched and judged. He found her one evening in the garden, standing near the very bench where they had first spoken openly weeks before, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "Do you believe the rumors will pass?" she asked, without turning to look at him. "I believe they will pass more quickly if we do not let them frighten us into retreating from each other," Edmund said, moving to stand beside her. "That is precisely what Julian wants, a wedge, and a weakened claim on the estate to follow it." Eleanor turned to look at him then, something searching in her expression. "And if it is not enough," she asked, "if the rumors grow worse before they fade?" "Then we face them together," Edmund said, taking her hand despite the open garden around them, despite the possibility of watching eyes from the house. "I have spent 2 years failing to stand beside you in any meaningful way. I do not intend to fail you now, when it matters more than it ever has before." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, only tightened her grip on his hand, drawing what comfort she could from the simple, steady weight of his presence beside her. Later that night, they sat together in Eleanor's study, the ledgers pushed aside in favor of Peter Grant's letter and the old family correspondence Edmund had uncovered in the archive. Together they worked through what little they knew of Julian's plans, trying to anticipate his next move before it could catch them unprepared. "If the newspaper prints something before we can respond," Eleanor said, thinking aloud, "then the damage will already be done regardless of what truth follows after. People remember the first story they hear far better than any correction that comes later." "Then we must ensure the first story to spread is one we control," Edmund said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "Rather than waiting for Julian's version to reach the city first, perhaps we should be the ones to speak plainly about the fire, about the arrangement it created, and let society hear the truth from us before it hears a distorted version from him." Eleanor considered this carefully. "A ball, perhaps," she suggested. "Or a dinner, something public enough that our own behavior toward each other speaks louder than any rumor could. If people see us together, genuinely together, it becomes far harder for Julian's version of events to take hold." The idea took shape between them over the following hour, a plan forming that would require both courage and careful timing. Courage neither of them had needed to summon in their marriage before this month of unexpected change had begun. Edmund found himself grateful, in a strange way, for the very crisis that threatened them, for it forced a kind of partnership between them that might otherwise have taken years longer to develop, if it had developed at all. "We will need to move quickly," Eleanor said, gathering the letters into a neat stack, "before Julian's editor finds a story worth printing." "Then we begin tomorrow," Edmund said, and for the first time since Julian's carriage had appeared at the gates, he felt something steadier settle in his chest, a sense that whatever came next, they would face it as partners rather than as two strangers sharing a roof out of necessity. Before retiring that night, Edmund sent word to Mrs. Abbott to begin preparations for a dinner within the week, one grand enough to draw the attention of the neighboring families and small enough to still feel intimate, a gathering designed to let society see for itself what kind of marriage now existed behind the estate's newly repaired walls. He also sent a second letter to Peter Grant, asking him to quietly look into whether the old land dispute Julian intended to revive had any true standing at all, or whether it was, as Edmund suspected, built on little more than resentment passed down through a family too proud to ever fully let go of an old grievance. Eleanor, for her part, wrote to her sister that night, correcting the rumors as plainly and calmly as she could, though she knew a single letter would do little to stop what had already begun spreading through the city. Still, she felt steadier for having written it, steadier still for the quiet presence of her husband beside her through it all. Neither of them yet knew how far Julian was prepared to go to see his scheme succeed, nor how soon they would be forced to prove, publicly and decisively, that the bond between them was stronger than any rumor designed to break it. A letter arrived from Peter Grant 3 days before the planned dinner, its contents grim enough that Edmund read it twice standing in the entrance hall before he even removed his riding gloves. Julian had secured a meeting with a magistrate known for his ambition, a man eager to attach his name to any case that might raise his standing in the city, and had submitted a formal inquiry questioning both the true cause of the fire and the state of Edmund's management of the estate. Worse still, Peter's letter confirmed that the old land dispute Julian intended to revive did, in fact, carry some technical standing in law, though weak and unlikely to succeed under close scrutiny. Weak claims, Peter warned, had a way of gaining unearned strength when wrapped inside a large enough scandal, particularly when a magistrate wished to be seen taking a bold stand against the aristocracy. Edmund found Eleanor in the garden reviewing seating arrangements for the dinner, and delivered the news plainly, without softening it. She listened with the same steady composure she had shown throughout the ordeal, though he noticed her hands tighten slightly around the papers in her lap. "Then the dinner must do more than simply show society a happy marriage," she said after a moment. "It must give us the chance to expose Julian directly, before he has the opportunity to bring his inquiry before the magistrate in earnest." Edmund considered this carefully. "Nathaniel has confirmed the fire began from an old fault in the chimney flue, not from any deliberate act. That much we can prove plainly enough, with the builders and the inspector both willing to testify to it. But the land dispute is a more delicate matter. Proving it groundless requires more than testimony. It requires documents Julian has likely gone to some trouble to keep hidden." It was Eleanor who suggested the solution, drawing on a skill Edmund had come to rely upon more each day. "If the original dispute was settled quietly 2 generations ago," she said, "there must be some record of that settlement, even if it was never made public. Your grandfather's brother would not have simply abandoned his claim without receiving something in exchange. Men rarely do. Before turning to the archive, Edmund and Eleanor spent a long evening simply talking through everything they knew of Julian, piecing together the shape of a man neither had ever truly understood before this crisis forced them to study him closely. Eleanor recalled small comments Julian had made during his visit, offhand remarks about creditors growing impatient, and about a card debt he had dismissed too quickly to seem entirely unconcerned. Edmund, in turn, remembered stories his father had told once, long ago, about a family rift that had never fully healed, though his father had always refused to discuss the particulars in any detail, preferring silence to old grievances. "We are missing something," Eleanor said, pacing slowly before the fire. Julian would not risk so much, debts, reputation, an inquiry before a magistrate, on a claim he did not at least partly believe might succeed. He must believe there is some flaw in how the original matter was settled, some gap he thinks he can exploit. "Then we must find whatever he believes he has found," Edmund said, "and resolve it before he can use it." Edmund spent the following day in the estate's private archive with Nathaniel, searching through boxes of old correspondence and ledgers that had not been opened in decades. They worked for hours through dust and faded ink, Nathaniel patiently sorting documents by date, while Edmund read through correspondence that grew increasingly tedious as the afternoon wore on. It was Eleanor who arrived in the late afternoon, having finished her own morning tasks and offered to help, bringing with her the same careful attention to detail she applied to the estate's yearly accounts. She began not with the correspondence, as Edmund had, but with the account books themselves, reasoning that any payment significant enough to settle a land dispute would have left a trace somewhere in the estate's financial records, regardless of whether the surrounding letters survived. Her instinct proved correct within the hour. It was Eleanor, in the end, who found what they needed, a receipt tucked inside an old account book, documenting a substantial payment made to Julian's grandfather at the time of the original dispute, a sum accepted in exchange for formally relinquishing all claim to the disputed lands. "This settles it entirely," Edmund said, examining the receipt with something close to relief for the first time in days. Julian's grandfather did not lose the claim through unfair treatment. He sold it, plainly and willingly, for a sum that would have been considerable at the time. "Then Julian either does not know this receipt exists," Eleanor said, "or he is gambling that no one else does either." Peter Grant arrived at the estate the following afternoon, summoned urgently to review the receipt and confirm its legal weight. He pronounced it more than sufficient to end any inquiry into the land dispute, provided it was presented properly and at the right moment, ideally before Julian's meeting with the magistrate could gain any further momentum. The dinner, originally planned as a simple display of marital harmony, transformed instead into something far more deliberate. Edmund extended an invitation to Julian directly, framing it as an olive branch after his cousin's recent visit, and made careful arrangements to ensure several prominent members of society, along with a respected barrister known to Peter Grant, would also be present. Julian arrived the evening of the dinner in high spirits, clearly believing himself in control of the unfolding situation, unaware of what awaited him. He greeted Edmund and Eleanor with his usual practiced charm, complimenting the rebuilt wing of the house, which had been completed just days before, and remarking with poorly hidden satisfaction on how quickly society's opinion could shift when given the right encouragement. The dinner proceeded smoothly through its early courses, conversation flowing easily among the guests, Julian holding court at one end of the table with stories designed to charm and entertain. Edmund waited patiently, allowing his cousin every opportunity to reveal his confidence fully before the moment came to act. It was Eleanor who raised the subject first, with a calm, deliberate grace that caught the table's attention without seeming forced. "Cousin Julian," she said, during a natural pause in the conversation, "I understand you have taken quite an interest in old family history recently. Edmund mentioned you inquired after the land dispute between your grandfather and his grandfather some decades past." Julian's easy smile faltered only slightly, quickly recovering. "A minor curiosity," he said. "Family history interests me a great deal." "Then you will be pleased to know the matter has finally been resolved with complete clarity," Eleanor continued smoothly, nodding to Edmund, who produced the old receipt from within his coat and passed it first to the barrister seated nearby for his professional opinion, before allowing it to circulate further among the guests. The barrister examined the document carefully, then confirmed aloud, in a clear voice that carried easily across the table, that the receipt represented full and final settlement of the very claim Julian had apparently sought to revive, a settlement freely accepted and properly recorded, leaving no legal standing whatsoever for any future inquiry into the matter. Julian's composure cracked visibly for the first time that evening, color rising in his face as the guests around the table exchanged curious, knowing glances. He attempted a laugh, brushing the matter aside as a simple misunderstanding, but the damage to his credibility was already spreading through the room as quickly as any rumor he had once tried to spread himself. Edmund pressed the advantage carefully, without cruelty, but without mercy either. "I understand you also raised questions about the cause of the fire, cousin," he said evenly. "Perhaps you would care to hear directly from the estate's own inspector, who examined the damage personally, and found the cause to be nothing more sinister than an aging chimney flue in need of repair, a fault entirely unrelated to any deliberate act by anyone within this household." The inspector, seated further down the table at Edmund's earlier invitation, confirmed this findings plainly, offering technical details about the flue's condition that left little room for doubt among the assembled guests. Julian sat through the explanation with a tight, forced smile, clearly aware that whatever plan he had arrived with that evening had unraveled entirely in front of the very audience he had hoped to use against Edmund and Eleanor. One of the neighboring gentlemen, an older baron known for his blunt manner, leaned toward Edmund with open curiosity once the barrister had finished speaking. "Remarkable thing," he said, "that your own Duchess uncovered the very document needed to settle the matter. Not every wife would take such an interest in old family disputes." "Not every wife manages this estate's accounts as carefully as mine does," Edmund replied, a note of genuine pride entering his voice that surprised even himself. "I have come to rely on her judgment in far more matters than I once thought wise to admit." The baron's wife, seated nearby, smiled warmly at Eleanor. "It is refreshing," she said, "to see a marriage strengthened by partnership rather than simply endured out of duty. One hears so little of it these days, especially among matches arranged as yours was." Eleanor accepted the compliment graciously, though Edmund noticed a faint color rise in her cheeks at the public acknowledgement of something they had only recently begun to understand privately. Julian, seated further down the table, said little through this exchange, his earlier confidence entirely drained from his expression, replaced by the careful stillness of a man calculating how much of his reputation could still be salvaged from the evening. By the time dinner concluded, the mood among the guests had shifted entirely in favor of the Duke and Duchess, several offering warm remarks about the strength of their marriage and the grace with which they had weathered such a difficult month. Julian departed early, offering a stiff excuse about a prior engagement, his usual easy charm entirely absent as he climbed into his carriage. Once the guests had departed and the house grew quiet again, Edmund found Eleanor in the drawing room, still glowing faintly with the satisfaction of the evening's success. "You handled him perfectly," he said, settling beside her on the small settee near the fire. "We handled him perfectly," she corrected gently. "This was never something either of us could have managed alone." Edmund considered this, and found he agreed completely. 2 months ago, he might have faced Julian's scheme in cold isolation, relying only on his own judgment and pride, likely stumbling through the confrontation without the careful planning that had made this evening's success possible. Instead, he had faced it beside a partner whose quiet intelligence and steady courage had proven every bit as vital as his own position and title. "I could not have found that receipt without you," he admitted. "I would not have thought to look in the account books at all." "You give yourself too little credit," she said. "You confronted him at the table with more composure than I expected. I was prepared for you to lose your temper entirely." "I very nearly did," he admitted, and she laughed softly, a sound that had become far more familiar to him over the past weeks than he ever could have anticipated when the fire first forced them together. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the rebuilt east wing standing solid and whole once more just beyond the walls of the room. The month that had once felt like an unwelcome obligation now felt, in its final days, like something neither of them was quite ready to see end. "The wing is finished," Eleanor said eventually, breaking the silence. "Nathaniel confirmed it this morning. Your old chambers are ready to be occupied again, whenever you wish to return to them." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, watching the firelight play across her face, considering the question buried within her simple statement far more carefully than the words themselves suggested. "Do you wish for me to return to them?" he asked finally. Eleanor turned to look at him fully, something vulnerable and honest passing behind her eyes for just a moment before she answered. "That depends entirely on what you wish, Edmund," she said quietly. "I have learned these past weeks not to assume anything about what you want, only to hope, carefully, that it might align with what I have come to want as well." Neither of them said anything further that night about what would happen once the final decision came due, but the question hung between them gently rather than anxiously, a far cry from the cold distance that had once defined every silence they shared. Edmund rose eventually and crossed to the window, looking out over the dark garden toward the newly rebuilt wing, its fresh stonework pale in the moonlight compared to the older, weathered walls surrounding it. "A month ago," he said quietly, "I stood in that courtyard and thought only of what I had lost. My chambers, my privacy, the careful solitude I had built my entire life around. I did not once consider what I might gain in its place." Eleanor joined him at the window, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "And now," she asked softly. "Now I find myself dreading the thought of an empty room at the end of a long hallway," he admitted. "I have grown accustomed to hearing you through these walls, to knowing you are near, even when we do not speak. I am not certain I wish to give that up simply because the builders have finished their work." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the moonlight settle over the garden below. "Then perhaps the builders finishing their work need not mean the same thing it once would have," she said carefully. "There are other arrangements possible, Edmund, if you wish to consider them. A marriage need not keep two people at opposite ends of a house simply because tradition suggests it should." Edmund turned to look at her fully then, something settling firmly in his chest, a certainty he had not expected to feel so completely after only 1 month. Whatever Julian had hoped to destroy between them with his scheme, he had, in the end, only made the bond between the Duke and his Duchess stronger and more certain than either of them had believed possible only 1 month before. The following morning brought news that Julian had departed the city entirely, retreating to a smaller property he kept in the countryside, likely to wait out the worst of the gossip now circulating at his own expense rather than Edmund's. Peter Grant confirmed by letter that the magistrate, having heard of the dinner and the receipt presented before several respected witnesses, had quietly abandoned any interest in pursuing Julian's inquiry further, unwilling to attach his own reputation to a claim so thoroughly discredited in public. Mrs. Abbott brought the news to breakfast with poorly disguised satisfaction, having never much cared for Julian's visits even before the scheme came to light. "It seems the house has settled itself in more ways than one, Your Grace," she said, setting down a fresh pot of tea. "The wing rebuilt, the rumors put to rest, and if I may say so without overstepping, a good deal more warmth in these halls than I have seen in all my years of service here." Edmund exchanged a glance with Eleanor across the table, both of them smiling at the housekeeper's characteristic bluntness. "You may say so, Mrs. Abbott," Edmund replied, "and you would not be wrong." Workmen arrived early on the final morning to move the last of Edmund's belongings from the temporary chamber back toward the rebuilt east wing, carrying trunks and boxes down the hallway past Eleanor's door as the household bustled with the quiet business of returning to something like normal. Edmund stood in the doorway of his old chambers, freshly rebuilt, the new timber pale and clean where the old had once stood scorched and blackened, and found the room felt strangely unfamiliar despite being, in every practical sense, exactly where he belonged. Nathaniel walked him through the final details of the reconstruction, pointing out the reinforced beams, the new plasterwork, the careful attention paid to matching the original style of the house despite the modern improvements hidden within the walls. "It is finished properly this time, Your Grace," Nathaniel said with quiet pride. "Should last another 100 years, provided no one leaves a candle burning too close to the curtains again." Edmund thanked him warmly, genuinely grateful for the weeks of careful work, though his attention kept drifting back down the hallway toward the connecting door he had grown so accustomed to over the past month. He found Eleanor later that afternoon in her study, surrounded by the familiar clutter of ledgers and correspondence, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "The room is ready," she said, looking up from her work. "Mrs. Abbott mentioned the last of your things were moved this morning." "They were," he confirmed, though he made no move to leave. Eleanor set down her pen, studying him carefully. "You do not seem particularly pleased about it," she observed. Edmund crossed the room slowly, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I have been considering our conversation from the other night," he said, "about arrangements, and what tradition suggests a marriage should look like, and whether that suggestion holds any real weight against what we have actually built these past weeks." "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "I have concluded that I do not wish to sleep at the far end of a long hallway, listening for sounds I can no longer hear, when the alternative has proven so much more comfortable," he said. "I would like to give up my rebuilt chambers entirely, or rather, use them as a study and dressing room, and join my life properly with yours, in every sense the word implies, not because a fire forced the arrangement upon us, but because I have chosen it freely, with clear eyes, and a mind no longer clouded by old assumptions about what a duke's marriage ought to be." Eleanor rose slowly from her desk, crossing the room to stand before him, searching his face for any trace of hesitation and finding none. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "This is not a decision to make lightly, out of gratitude for a difficult month weathered together." "I am entirely certain," Edmund said. I have spent 2 years believing distance was simply the nature of an arranged marriage, a lesson inherited from my father that I never once thought to question. This past month taught me otherwise. I do not wish to unlearn it simply because the walls have been repaired. Eleanor reached up and touched his face gently, an intimacy that would have felt impossible between them only weeks before. Then let it be as you wish, she said. Though I will insist the connecting door remains exactly where it is, in case either of us ever needs a moment of solitude the size of a single room, rather than an entire wing. Edmund laughed, a full and easy sound that surprised even him with its lightness. Agreed entirely, he said. That evening, before any announcement was made to the wider household, Edmund asked Mrs. Abbott to join him privately in the study, wishing to inform her directly rather than let the news reach her second-hand through the usual channels of household gossip. She listened with visible delight as he explained the change, her composed housekeeper's manner briefly giving way to something warmer. I confess I hoped for this from the very first week, Your Grace, she admitted. I have served this family since before you were born, and I never once saw your father share so much as a meal with your mother by choice. It did my heart good to see something different beginning to grow between you and the Duchess. Edmund considered her words carefully. Did my mother suffer the same distance then? He asked, a question he realized he had never thought to ask before. Mrs. Abbott's expression grew gentler, tinged with old sadness. She did, Your Grace, though she bore it with grace, as your Duchess might have continued to do indefinitely, had the fire not intervened. I am glad you found your way to something better before it was too late to matter. The conversation stayed with Edmund long after Mrs. Abbott had left the room, a quiet confirmation of everything he had begun to understand about the cost of the distance his father had taught him to value above all else. He resolved, in that moment, to ensure his own household would carry forward a different lesson entirely, one built on partnership rather than cold duty. The decision, once made privately between them, soon became something to announce more broadly, not out of any need to prove anything further to society, but simply because both of them wished to mark the moment properly. Edmund arranged a small gathering of close family and trusted friends, a far more intimate affair than the strategic dinner that had exposed Julian's scheme weeks before, meant only to celebrate rather than defend anything. Eleanor's sister traveled from the countryside to attend, her earlier concern from the worried letter now replaced entirely with visible relief at seeing her sister's transformed circumstances firsthand. She pulled Eleanor aside early in the evening, studying her carefully. You look happy, she said simply, something like wonder in her voice. Truly happy, not merely composed, the way you always were before. I am happy, Eleanor admitted, and found she meant it completely, without reservation or careful qualification. Edmund, for his part, found himself the recipient of a similarly direct observation from an old family friend of his father's, a gentleman who had known him since boyhood and had watched him grow into the same careful coldness his father had modeled for him throughout his childhood. You have become a different man these past weeks, the gentleman observed, watching Edmund and Eleanor move easily together through the gathered guests. Your father would hardly recognize you, I think. I hope he would be glad of it, regardless, Edmund replied, and found that he believed the words completely. No longer burdened by the need to prove himself against a standard of cold detachment he had finally recognized as a poor foundation for any life worth living. Midway through the evening, Edmund rose from his seat and asked quietly for a moment of everyone's attention, an unusual gesture for a man who had spent years avoiding any occasion that drew focus toward himself. The room quieted, guests turning with curious expressions as Eleanor watched him from her own seat, uncertain what he intended to say. I did not gather you all here tonight simply to celebrate the completion of the East Wing, though I am grateful to Nathaniel and his builders for their fine work, Edmund began, nodding toward the steward, who inclined his head modestly in return. I gathered you here because I wished to say, plainly and before witnesses, something I should have said 2 years ago and failed to understand until a fire forced me to see it clearly. He turned to look at Eleanor directly, and though his voice remained steady, something unguarded had entered his expression that few in the room had ever seen from him before. I married my wife because it was arranged for us, and for 2 years I treated that arrangement as though warmth had no place within it. I was wrong. Eleanor has managed this estate with more care and wisdom than I ever gave her credit for, has weathered scandal and rumor with more grace than I could have managed alone, and has shown me, patiently and without complaint, exactly the kind of partner I did not know to hope for. I do not intend to waste whatever years remain to us, pretending otherwise any longer. A soft murmur of approval moved through the gathered guests, and Eleanor's sister pressed a hand to her mouth, visibly moved. Eleanor herself rose from her seat and crossed to stand beside him, her hand finding his without hesitation in front of the entire room, a gesture that would have been unthinkable between them only a month before. "I have very little to add, except that I am glad the fire happened," she said, drawing soft laughter from the guests, if only because it gave us both the excuse we apparently needed to stop being so careful with each other. The gathering erupted into warm applause and laughter, glasses raised in a toast that Nathaniel offered with visible emotion, wishing the Duke and Duchess many more years of the partnership they had so plainly discovered together. As the evening's conversation resumed around them, Edmund kept Eleanor's hand in his, unwilling to let go of the moment just yet. As the evening wore on, Edmund found a quiet moment to steal Eleanor away from the gathering entirely, leading her out to the garden bench beneath the old oak tree where so much of their understanding had first taken root weeks before. The evening air was cool and pleasant, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting faintly from the house behind them. "Do you remember the falling urn?" he asked, settling beside her on the familiar bench. "Vividly," she said, smiling. "I still have the mark on my dress where the dust settled, though Alice insists she can remove it entirely if given enough time and patience." "I am glad it fell," he said, strange as that sounds. "I am glad for the fire, too, though I would never have said such a thing a month ago. Strange, how destruction sometimes clears space for something better to grow in its place, if two people are willing to let it." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, a small, natural gesture that would have been unthinkable between them only weeks before. "Perhaps we were always capable of this," she said quietly. "We simply needed something loud enough to interrupt the quiet distance we had both grown too comfortable maintaining." They sat together beneath the old oak tree as the sounds of the gathering continued behind them. Two people who had entered their marriage as strangers, bound only by arrangement and duty, now bound instead by something they had built deliberately, choice by choice, conversation by conversation, through a single difficult month that had changed everything neither of them had known needed changing. In the weeks that followed, the estate settled into a new and comfortable rhythm, entirely different from the careful distance of the years before. Edmund joined Eleanor each evening in what had once been her private study alone, now shared between them as a place for both accounts and conversation. The staff, no longer uncertain how to serve two people living separate lives under one roof, moved through the household with a lightness that seemed to have settled over the entire estate along with its rebuilt walls. Nathaniel remarked once, over tea with Mrs. Abbott, that he had never seen a house recover so completely from disaster, not merely in its stonework but in something far less visible and far more valuable. Mrs. Abbott only nodded in quiet agreement, having watched the entire transformation unfold from its very first chaotic night, when smoke had filled the halls and two strangers bound by marriage had been forced, by nothing more than simple necessity, into the same small hallway that would eventually change everything about the life they built together. Months later, when autumn had settled fully over the estate and the memory of the fire had faded into little more than an occasional story told over dinner, Edmund found himself once again standing in the garden beneath the old oak tree, watching Eleanor walk toward him from the house with a letter in her hand. Peter Grant had written to confirm, finally and completely, that Julian's claim to the estate had been formally and permanently withdrawn, the magistrate's earlier inquiry closed without further action, and that Julian himself had quietly settled his debts through the sale of his smaller countryside property, choosing distance from the city rather than face the lingering consequences of his failed scheme. "It is truly finished, then," Eleanor said, handing him the letter to read for himself. Edmund scanned the familiar, careful handwriting, then folded the letter and tucked it away, feeling a quiet satisfaction rather than any lingering anger toward his cousin. "Let him keep his distance," he said. "I find I have very little interest in dwelling on it further. There are far better things to occupy my attention now." Eleanor smiled, settling onto the bench beside him as she had done so many times since that first difficult month, though the ease between them now felt as natural as breathing, nothing like the careful, hesitant conversations that had once required so much courage to begin. "Mrs. Abbott mentioned this morning that the roses along the east wing have finally recovered from the fire," she said. "New growth, right where the old bushes had burned." Edmund glanced toward the rebuilt wing, its stonework no longer looking new against the older walls, already settling into the estate's long history, as though it had always belonged there. "Fitting," he said. "I have come to think the fire did us both a strange kindness, in the end, however painful it seemed at the time. It burned away things that needed clearing, and left room enough for something better to take root in their place." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the late afternoon light settle golden over the garden. "I used to think a marriage like ours was simply something to endure quietly," she admitted. "I never imagined it might become something worth looking forward to each day instead. Nor did I, Edmund said honestly. But I am glad, more than I know how to properly say, that it did. They sat together as the sun began its slow descent behind the tree line. Two people who had entered their marriage as strangers bound only by duty and arrangement, now bound instead by every quiet choice they had made together since the night smoke first filled the halls of their home. The fire that destroyed the Duke's chambers had taken something from him, certainly, memories and belongings that could never be fully replaced. But in its place, it had given him something he had not known to look for in 2 years of careful, cold distance, a partner who understood him more completely than he had ever believed possible, and a marriage built not on arrangement and obligation, but on the quiet, deliberate choice two people made to truly see each other at last. The following spring brought an unexpected letter from Eleanor's sister, inviting them both to visit the countryside estate where Eleanor had grown up, an invitation Edmund accepted immediately, eager to see the world that had shaped the woman he had come to know so completely over the past year. Eleanor packed for the journey with a lightness Edmund had rarely seen in her, humming softly as she folded dresses into a travel trunk, clearly delighted at the prospect of returning home with a husband who finally wished to know every corner of her life. The journey took the better part of 2 days, winding north through countryside that grew increasingly wild and beautiful the further they traveled from the city. Edmund watched Eleanor grow more animated with each mile, pointing out landmarks from her childhood, a bend in the river where she had learned to swim, a hill where she and her sister had once raced their ponies until their mothers scolded them both for recklessness. "You never speak of any of this at home," he said at one point, watching her lean eagerly toward the carriage window. "There was never much occasion to," she admitted. "You never asked, and I had grown used to keeping these memories to myself." "I intend to ask a great deal more from now on," he said, and meant it fully. They arrived at the modest countryside house Eleanor's mother still maintained, smaller and simpler than the grand estate Edmund had grown up within, but warm in a way that struck him immediately upon entering. Eleanor's mother greeted them both with genuine affection, studying Edmund with the careful, appraising eyes of a woman determined to see for herself whether her daughter's letters describing a transformed marriage held any truth. "You look well," she told Eleanor privately, while Edmund unpacked in the guest room down the hall. "Truly well. I confess I worried a great deal these past 2 years, though I never wished to burden you with my concerns." "I know," Eleanor said, embracing her mother warmly. "I am sorry I did not write more honestly about how things stood. I did not wish anyone to worry, and I had convinced myself the distance was simply the nature of such an arranged match." "And now," her mother asked, though her eyes had already found the answer in her daughter's face. "Now everything is changed," Eleanor said simply, and her mother's answering smile carried the quiet relief of a parent finally certain her child had found genuine happiness. During their stay, Edmund insisted on visiting the northern lakes Eleanor had once longed to see as a girl, using the very map he had given her months before, its edges now softened from repeated folding and unfolding during quiet evenings spent planning the trip together. They rode out early one morning, just the two of them, leaving the carriage behind in favor of horses better suited to the narrower countryside paths. The lakes, when they finally came into view, stretched wide and silver beneath the morning light, ringed by hills still green with early spring growth. Eleanor drew her horse to a stop at the crest of the final hill, taking in the view with an expression Edmund had never quite seen on her before, something between childhood wonder and adult disbelief, that a long-held dream had finally, quietly come true. "It is exactly as I imagined it," she said softly. Edmund dismounted and helped her down as well, and they walked together along the shoreline for a long while, saying little, content simply to share the moment neither had expected to experience together when this journey first began. Eventually they settled on a flat rock near the water's edge, watching the light shift slowly across the surface of the lake. "I used to imagine coming here alone," Eleanor admitted eventually. "I never pictured anyone beside me. I had grown so used to the idea that my life would simply be mine to manage quietly, without much room for anyone else in it." "And now," Edmund asked, echoing her mother's earlier question without quite realizing it, "now I cannot imagine wanting to be here without you," she said simply, and Edmund found the words settled into him with a warmth that no title or inheritance had ever managed to provide. They lingered by the lake until the afternoon light began to soften, reluctant to end a day that felt, in its quiet way, like the truest honeymoon their marriage had ever properly enjoyed, arriving a full year later than tradition might have expected, but no less meaningful for the delay. On the ride back toward Eleanor's family home, she grew quiet beside him, something clearly weighing on her thoughts. Edmund noticed and slowed his horse to match her pace. "Is something troubling you?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her riding coat and withdrew a small folded letter, one Edmund recognized as having arrived from their own physician just before they departed the estate. "I did not wish to share this until I was certain," she said carefully, "and until we had a quiet moment away from the household to discuss it properly." Edmund felt his chest tighten with a mixture of curiosity and concern as she unfolded the letter and passed it to him. He read the physician's careful, formal handwriting twice before the meaning fully settled, and when it did, something bright and unexpected bloomed in his chest, entirely different from the careful, guarded emotions he had spent most of his life managing. "You are certain?" he asked, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised him. "As certain as the physician can be this early," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "I did not know how you would receive the news. We have never spoken of children directly, not since everything changed between us." Edmund dismounted quickly and crossed to help her down as well, drawing her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words he might have managed in that moment. "I could not imagine better news," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Not for the sake of an heir, though I know that matters to some. For us. For the family I did not know I wanted until you showed me what one could actually look like." Eleanor laughed softly against his shoulder, relief and joy mingling freely in the sound. "I hoped you would say something like that," she admitted, "though I confess I practiced several other responses on the ride here, in case you needed convincing. I do not think I will ever need convincing of anything where you are concerned," he said, and meant every word of it completely. They returned to Eleanor's family home that evening with news that transformed the remainder of their visit into a quiet, joyful celebration. Eleanor's mother weeping happy tears at the prospect of a grandchild, her sister already offering unsolicited advice about names and nursery arrangements that made Eleanor laugh more freely than Edmund had ever seen. The journey back to the estate a week later felt different from the one that had carried them north, lighter somehow, filled with quiet conversation about the future rather than careful navigation of a still-forming partnership. Edmund found himself already imagining the nursery that would need preparing, the old family cradle that had rocked generations of Hale children waiting somewhere in the estate's vast attics, needing only to be found and restored. When they finally arrived home, Mrs. Abbott greeted them at the door with her usual composed warmth, though her expression shifted to open delight the moment Eleanor shared the news. The housekeeper pressed a hand to her chest, visibly moved. "This house has needed the sound of a child's laughter for far too long," she said. "I am glad it will finally have reason to hear it again." Nathaniel, informed later that same evening, offered his own quiet congratulations, along with a promise that the nursery would be among the very first rooms he personally oversaw preparing, a fitting continuation of the same careful craftsmanship that had rebuilt the East Wing only a year before. That night, Edmund and Eleanor stood together at the window of their shared chambers, looking out over the moonlit garden where so much of their story had unfolded, from the falling urn to the quiet confessions on the bench beneath the old oak tree. Edmund wrapped an arm around her, resting his hand gently against her waist, still hardly able to believe how completely his life had transformed from the cold, careful distance he had once believed was simply his inheritance to accept. "A year ago," he said quietly, "I lay awake in an unfamiliar room, listening to you through a thin wooden door, certain a month would pass slowly and painfully before I could return to my old life. I did not know that old life was the very thing worth losing." Eleanor leaned into him, watching the same moonlight settle over the garden below. "I am glad the fire found us when it did," she said. "Whatever it destroyed, it gave us far more than it ever took away." Edmund pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and together they stood in comfortable silence, two people who had built, quietly and deliberately, out of ash and unexpected proximity, a marriage far richer than either had ever believed themselves entitled to hope for. In the months that followed, the estate settled into new rhythms shaped by the coming arrival. Nathaniel located the old family cradle exactly where household legend claimed it would be, tucked beneath a dust sheet in the farthest corner of the attic, its wood still sound despite decades of disuse. He restored it carefully over several quiet evenings, sanding away the years of neglect until the old carved details along its edges, a pattern of oak leaves matching the very tree in the garden, emerged clearly once again. Eleanor spent many of her afternoons in the nursery as it slowly took shape, choosing fabrics and colors with the same careful attention she brought to the estate's ledgers, though this task brought her a different kind of satisfaction entirely. Edmund often joined her there in the evenings, no longer retreating to a separate study out of old habit, content instead to sit beside her while she sewed or planned, offering opinions on curtains and colors he would once have considered entirely beneath his notice. Word of the coming child spread quietly through the estate, and, eventually, through society as well, carried this time not by scheming tongues eager for scandal, but by the genuine warmth of neighbors and friends who had watched the Duke and Duchess weather a difficult season and emerge from it stronger than anyone had expected. Even Julian, from his quiet countryside retreat, sent a brief and uncharacteristically humble letter of congratulations, one Edmund read with more grace than resentment, choosing at last to let old grievances settle as quietly as the family dispute that had once fueled them. As summer approached and the child's arrival drew nearer, Edmund found himself, more often than not, standing at the window of the rebuilt East Wing in the early evenings, watching Eleanor tend the roses that had grown back thick and fragrant along the garden wall. He thought often, in those quiet moments, of the fire that had once seemed like the worst misfortune to ever touch his careful, ordered life, and marveled at how completely it had instead become the beginning of everything that mattered most to him. Whatever the years ahead might bring, storms, difficulties, the ordinary trials that touched every family regardless of title or fortune, Edmund felt certain of one thing above all else. He would never again mistake distance for strength, nor silence for peace. He had learned, in the space of a single difficult month and the year that followed it, that the truest foundation of any home was not built from timber and stone alone, but from the quiet, deliberate choice to stand beside another person fully, through fire and rebuilding both, until the two truly became one household in every sense that mattered.